Hey everybody, so in today's video I am going to be building the desk slash workbench for my desk, but one of my daily duties on the way out to the workshop is to check the pool for frogs and toads, and the reason for this is because they can't get out of the pool and I hate to see them floating belly up in here. So my first duty of the day is to walk by the pool and scoop up any guys that fall in there. By the way, I have bought one of those little, they call it a frog ladder on Amazon. They don't work. It's a waste of money. The other problem is you can toss them out in the yard and 30 seconds later they're right back to the pool waiting for you to leave so they can jump in again. These guys have a death wish. I don't know what it is with these guys. You dummy, I ain't got time for all this. I gotta build a desk. So for the desk of my van, I need an area where I can store my microwave. I do a lot of computer work, so I might need an area to work on my laptop or actually work on a computer. I'm going to put my power station batteries in here. I mean, basically this is the major work area and the major storage area of the van. It's going to run all the way from the back all the way up to the sliding door. So basically I decided to use the same plans that I used for the bed. I just modified the dimensions and the top a little bit. The desk is going to be 6 foot long, so it's going to run from the rear of the van all the way to the opening of the sliding door. I did some math. It's going to be 21 inches deep with an extension for a keyboard tray, and it's going to be 30 inches tall because I sat on the bed, held my hands out like I was typing on an imaginary keyboard, and decided 30 inches seemed like the right height. If you watched the last video, you remember my wife convinced me to start making a cut list, which is a good idea. Because the length of the 2x4s, the long runs are 66 inches tall, that leaves me with 30 inches, which I already said is what I wanted the height to be. So that's how I'm going to cut those 2x4s, and basically I just made a list here of everything I need to cut. So, you know, none of this is rocket science. If it was, I couldn't do it. I want to point out that little brace that you can see. I put my 2x4s on when I'm cutting them on my miter saw there. That's just two 2x4s screwed together that are on their sides, but they on their sides, it's exactly 3.5 inches tall, and my saw workspace is also 3.5 inches tall. So if I have long pieces of wood that I need to chop up, I use that little thing to place them on. But again, what I'm doing here is just going down my cut list and chopping up 2x4s and stacking them into piles. As you can see, after just a few minutes, the stacks of 2x4s are starting to pile up. Again, I'm just sorting them by size so that I can grab which ones I need as I start to assemble things. Occasionally, when I'm cutting things like the 30-inch ones, which have to be the exact same length because they're the 4 legs, I'll use one as a template. I'll put it on top of the other one and cut it with the saw blade exactly up against the top one so that the cuts are identical. But anyway, you know, none of this is, again, it's not hard to do. There's no 45-degree angle cuts in this plan. There's nothing fancy. We're not doing any dowels or anything fancy like that. This is all straight old 2x4 cutting stuff and screwing stuff together. It's pretty simple. Now, once I had all the 2x4s cut, I decided to go ahead and cut my pieces of plywood. I did something that I've never done before on a project, and I bought 2 foot by 4 foot sheets of plywood instead of 4 by 8 sheets of plywood. We actually went and picked this up. I was doing some other stuff. It fit better in the van. It was lighter to deal with, and they had these pieces of plywood that were finished on one side, and since I'm using them for the top of the desk, I thought that would be important. Now, I will tell you this, buying 2 of these sheets, which these sheets are 1/4 of a 4x8 sheet of plywood, and buying 2 of them cost more than a 4x8 sheet of plywood. So in theory, I really should have just bought a big 4x8 sheet of plywood, but I was kind of being lazy. These were really convenient, but I'm telling you right now, they were way more expensive. I'm using my metal track saw here as a straight edge to draw these lines. Again, my desk is going to be 6 foot long and 21 inches deep, so this is going to cover 1/2 of the desk, which means I have to cut the 4 foot length down to 3 foot, and I have to cut the 24 inches which is the 2-foot side, down to 21 inches. Again, not too complicated. If you've watched my videos, you know the next step is using these quick clamps to hold everything in place. I hold the wood to the workbench and hold the metal rail where it's supposed to go. I always say that in the long run, these quick clamps are cheaper than friends, and they don't have as many fingers to chop off. So they're a great investment. I have probably 6. And whenever I see them on sale, Harbor Freight puts them on sale quite often. Sometimes you'll see them cheap at some home improvement type stores or whatever. But I always buy them in pairs because they're different lengths, so I always get 2 that match. But I use them all the time. I use them on every single project. Again, it's way less guilt involved in using these than asking people to come hold stuff for you. With everything lined up and measured multiple times, now it's time to just saw the wood. I measured everything multiple times because I was super nervous because this wood was more expensive than what I normally purchase. I'm using my Ryobi 5-inch circular saw on this. I do have a heavy-duty Black & Decker corded circular saw, but this plywood is not thick and these 2x4s aren't too bad. Now I have had to resort to a corded saw when I'm doing some heavy duty cutting, but for all of this type of stuff, these cordless tools have worked great. Now it's time to begin assembling the desk. Now I've mentioned on previous videos that I have a bad back. I have a bulging disc and a ruptured disc in my back, plus some of my vertebrae are now beginning to fuse together thanks to some calcium deposits. So this is all great news. That means it's really hard for me to bend over and do things on the floor, to bend down and do projects on the ground level, and so it's much easier for me to work on top of this workbench. So essentially what I'm doing today is building a table on top of another table. The first part that I'm building right now is essentially the top rectangle part of the frame. So this is the part that the plywood will go on top of the very top. So this part needs to be 6 foot long and 21 inches deep. So obviously I had to make them 3 inches shorter than 6 foot to accommodate for the width of the 2 2x4s that are on the end. Sometimes I feel like a shill for Ryobi tools, and I'm really not, although I do have Amazon links to them, so maybe I am a shill. But I have found these projects so much easier to have both a drill and an impact driver. So instead of constantly switching drill bits back and forth, what I do is I use a drill bit on one to pre-drill all my holes, and then I use the impact driver to drive them screws right in there. So I did a project like this recently with some 2x4s, and what I found was I was using drywall screws that were only 2 inches long, and they weren't long enough to hold everything together. So I had to order some 2.5 and 3 inch screws off of Amazon, and that's what I'm using on this project. Now here's a little secret Easter egg on the old desk here. On the other end I used a 2x4 obviously, but on this end I'm using a smaller 2x2, and there's a reason for that. The dimensions of this desk have to be what the dimensions of this desk have to be. I know that sounds like a crazy sentence, but I want it to be 30 inches tall, and the bottom shelf has to be 9.5 to 10 inches off the ground. So that shelf has to be where it's at. The top has to be where it's at. So all the distances between those things are basically set in stone. And once I was looking at the numbers, I realized that my all powers battery would not fit in the bottom shelf. It's high enough, but it won't slide past these 2x4s that are on the front. And so all I needed was like 3/4 of an inch space. And so the way that I got that space was to use a 2x2 on this end instead of a 2x4. Now this is the end that faces the rear of the van. So when I open my rear door, I'll be able to slide my power station in and out this way into the storage area. So nobody will ever see it or know about it except for you guys that watch this video. So if you ever see my van, feel free to mention that you noticed the 2x2 back here, and I'll give you a free BigRobsVan sticker. Of course, since I used a 2x2 instead of a 2x4, it's not quite as high as the 2x4, so I had to cut these little 1.5 inch blocks, and I screwed them into the 2x4 just so everything fits flush. Again, on my last project, I bought, like one time I bought a lifetime supply of drywall screws and I use them a lot, but these longer screws really made a difference on this project. Now it's time to assemble the legs. So let me just explain real quick what I've done here, because I modified what I did. If you watched the bed video, in which I used a 2x4 running from the front to the back as a big long leg that kind of worked as a stabilizer and also held a lot of the weight. So what I did on this one was I cut these 6-inch cubes and I put them at the bottom. Then I put a 2x4 running front to back for the support, and then I put the long running 2x4s to hold the second shelf. So the reason I did that is because, number one, I could put a lot of weight on this shelf now. The weight is all distributed directly to the ground on those other 2x4s, so that really helps out. Also, now that I've lifted the sides of this, I can slide things underneath. Now, I will say this. Those 2x4s that I put from the front to the back, they don't really need to go all the way across, because there's a second 2x4 that does stabilization here, and so I could probably cut those out. I may notch the one out that faces either. I might actually notch both of them out now that I think about it. It's just a couple of simple cuts. They're not really necessary, and it would allow me to have more storage space on the ends. I could slide things easier in. So like if we take our tent or camping chairs or something like that, I'd be able to slide it all the way in underneath the desk. So there's going to be a couple of quick cuts here, but first of all, I'm flipping the entire table over. You can see with the legs affixed on both ends, this thing is already super solid, but I'm about to make it a lot more solid. What I'm building here is the rectangle support that will go on top of those bottom legs. This will hold the bottom shelf. So you can see how solid this is. I really didn't need those extra 2x4s on the legs on the side, but I feel better with them there. So anyway, I'm running out of workspace here, as you can see. I'm really trying to balance these 2x4s, and I'm using some of my quick clamps and all the tricks that I have to be able to assemble this. I partially put some screws into the wood so that all I had to do was hold them in place temporarily very quickly with the quick clamps, and then drive screws in so that I could assemble this middle piece. Once this goes in, I'm going to drive 1,800 other screws all over the place, and this part is not going anywhere. Here it is with the lower support installed. You can see now I've got 2x4s running lengthwise on both levels. Now it's time to put the plywood on. So I pre-cut that plywood as you saw previously in the video. It fits exactly. Each piece is 3 foot wide, so I can put 2 of them, and that will cover the 6 foot tall or 6 foot long work area, and they are 21 inches. So they pretty much line up exactly as I thought. I hate to admit it, but I am getting better at woodworking. And by getting better, I mean I'm not an absolute train wreck. I'm just like a multi-car collision. This is when you know you have run out of workspace area, when you're using the desk you're building as a desk to cut other pieces of wood. So I've already got the top screwed on, and actually I used those drywall nails or drywall screws that I was talking about earlier. They were plenty long enough to go through this plywood into the 2x4s, and so now I've got to trim the bottom 2 pieces of plywood. These are not quite as long because they're going inside the 2x4, so they're not quite 6 foot in length, but they are 21 inches deep. And to vary where the seam is, I didn't want a common point of failure, so I actually left the first one completely 4 foot long, and then I just trimmed the second one to finish the gap on the bottom shelf. When I saw this clip, the first thing I said was, man, I really should have altered the depth of that blade, but I didn't, and here we are. So live and learn. The next step was putting the plywood on the bottom shelf, and again you could kind of see the design here. Those 2x4s are resting on other 2x4s which ultimately sit on the ground, so the weight of whatever I put on this shelf is not being held in place by screws, it's being held by gravity. Just like before, I pre-drilled all my holes using my drill, and then I used my impact driver to put the screws into the wood. This plywood was so expensive that I didn't want to take a chance of splitting it, and I'm screwing things in right near the edge. So this definitely worked for me. And again, there's nothing worse than having to sit there and switch drill bits out 180,000 times. So so this worked great. And look at those drywall screws; they go right in there. Zoobity-zoo. Hey, shout out to Home Depot. Look at the quality of that 2x4. What a beautiful masterpiece. Now it's time to move the desk outside for all the fun, messy stuff. We're going to do some sanding, then we're going to do some painting. I once watched a video on how to repair scratches in cars, and the video talked about using 100 grit sandpaper and then 300 grit and then maybe 500 or 600 and then working it down to 1000 grit. And I'm going to be dead honest with you, I have no idea what grit of sandpaper I used on this project. You know what grit I used? Whatever grit was on that rotary sander when I picked it up. I want to say it was probably maybe 100 grit, maybe 300 grit. Don't know, don't care. Really what I was interested in doing is getting all the splinters off of everything, because some of the 2x4s had splinters and I wanted to soften the edges just a little bit on the desk. I decided not to use my router on the edges of this because you'll see with the construction it doesn't really make sense, but I also don't want to be pressing up against a sharp corner, so that was kind of the idea here. If you've ever thought that watching one of my videos was like watching paint dry, well, today's your lucky day, because that's what's happening now. I actually go to Habitat for Humanity and I buy their paint. It really needs to be stirred up because it sits for a really long time, and they only have like 8 basic colors, but they do have black, white, and gray, so that's what most of my projects end up being. Now, I came up with this idea for the desk. I wanted to really highlight that plywood I put on top, so I thought about staining it, but it just doesn't match the color scheme of the inside of my van. And so what I ended up doing was painting the tops of those pieces of plywood white and everything else gray. Here's a quick shot of the desk flipped over. The tops have been painted, but we're not done yet. I still have to put on those keyboard extenders, and I'm going to drill some holes for running cables. To make these keyboard extenders, I used flip-up latches that I got off Amazon. They were about $15 a pair, and they say they will hold 260 pounds each, so should be plenty enough to hold my laptop. I also bought these plastic cable management inserts off of Amazon. I bought them a million years ago. I've had them sitting in a drawer forever, and I thought, hey, you know what? I'm going to use them on this project. To install them, all I had to do was cut a 2-inch hole, and oh, guess who's back? The final step of this project is getting this monstrosity installed in the van. Now, the first thing you can see is that it's facing the wrong direction. Those outlets should be on the back side. So the easiest thing I figured to do was to stand it up on end, rotate it around, and then walk it over towards the van. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I'm really not supposed to be lifting or moving heavy things, so this was the best plan I could come up with at the time. So I walked it across the driveway just a little bit until I could get the 2 legs of the desk in, and then I lifted it up and pushed it in. You can see how good those keyboard extenders look when they're folded down. And then on the bottom right there, you can see that I have 2 2x4s going across there for that support, and I think I'm going to cut that bottom one out. That's the one I'm talking about. That will give me a little bit more clearance for putting things like camping chairs and folding chairs, or you know, anything that's long and skinny like that. The tents will be able to slide in underneath this thing. Plus, I'm using it. I put my Rubbermaid storage underneath these things. So that's pretty much it. It slid right in. Everything fit. Everything worked. Chalk this one up as a win. It's such a rarity on this van. So Van 1.0 is looking way better than whatever I would call the previous, the beta or alpha version. So hey, thanks for watching this video. Thanks for watching me chase frogs around the property. Thanks to all my patrons for supporting me. Thanks to everybody who bought me a coffee. And thanks for watching the videos that I talked in. The vow of silence is definitely over.